Alrighty, in this video, we are going to take a look at some of the awesome stuff that we can do with an action bar. In particular, we're mostly going to be focused on buttons. So buttons are pretty important as far as action bar goes. As you saw in the previous examples, buttons go in the action bar to really facilitate a lot of the navigation. So like to create a new text or to compose a new email or anything like that, you would want to put that in a button in your action bar to be consistent with the rest of the Android design language. So we're going to look at how we can go about doing that, and everything will be awesome. Well, we're also going to take a look at a couple other cool things. So let's go ahead and jump into our main activity, because this is where we go about adding in action bar buttons. So action bar buttons are added in an activity level. You should really think about action bars being owned by an activity. So whenever we want to manipulate an action bar, we access it through that particular activity. Now, in this particular video, we don't need to manipulate the action bar directly. The reason for that is Android has a built-in way for an activity to describe its options menu. Now, options menu has a very specific meaning in Android, because in earlier versions of Android, if you guys are familiar with phones that were manufactured during the version 1 and version 2 reigns of terror, you had this hardware menu button, and when you click the hardware menu button, you got a 6-button panel that popped up, and it had your options for that particular activity. And so that's what an options menu is in Android speak. Basically, it used to be just these buttons, that little 6 buttons that appeared when you hit your menu button on your hardware or your hardware menu button on your device. But since Honeycomb, Google really deprecated that feature or that user interface paradigm in favor of action bars, and they leveraged the existing ways that you hooked into those option menus in order to populate action bars. So the infrastructure is already there. I can go ahead and I can add in a couple methods into main activity that would previously have to do with the options menu, and because I'm running with something that has an action bar, in this case at the app.compat support library, it's going to pick up on those methods, and it's going to go ahead and populate our action bar for us without us having to even reference the action bar whatsoever. So I think that's really awesome. Furthermore, what's also cool about this, or not cool depending on how you feel about things, the primary way in which you go about populating your action bar menu has to do with with a new XML file, with a new resource file. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started, I guess. Might as well. Again, you guys don't have to follow along with this. I just want to write out the code for you and show it to you, and we'll be obviously seeing a lot of examples of doing this sort of thing when we start using action bars in the application we're writing. But for now, let's just work on this dummy application. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and write a method. It's going to be an override method, surprise, surprise, and it's going to be a public, public boolean create options menu. And the onCreate options menu method is going to take in a menu object, which of course I'm going to import from the android.view package, and it's going to be called menu. So what's going on here? We have a public boolean onCreate options menu that's taking in a menu object. Now, a couple important notes about this particular method signature. The public is necessary. That's because the base class makes it public. That's unlike the onCreate method, which I should have written as protected, because you should always use the least amount of accessibility when doing this sort of thing. So the onCreate method is protected. It can be made public. However, the onCreate options menu must be public, cannot be made protected. And it's passing in this menu object. And this menu object is this object that allows us to, well, manipulate a menu. I mean, a menu in Android is this sort of abstract, nebulous concept of a list of items. And it's used in a couple different scenarios, like pop-up menus or context menus. But in this case, the menu abstraction is what's going to be used to populate our options menu, and in turn, populate our action bar. So you might be looking, well, there's a bunch of these add methods, and they really don't look all that user-friendly. I mean, there's a couple methods that look interesting in here, like removing items, adding items. We can do something like finding items and all that fun stuff. But we really should look for a little bit more of a convenient way to go about constructing the menu itself instead of doing it manually through the menu object. And the way we do that is, well, like I said earlier, we're going to use an XML file. And that XML file is not surprisingly going to be read in by, guess what's going to be called? The menu inflator. So just like we have our layout inflator, which takes a layout XML file and turns it into a set of objects, our menu inflator takes a menu XML file and turns it into a set of objects, and then stuffs all those objects into our menu object. So basically what I can do here is I can say get menu inflator. So the get menu inflator is a method I inherited from activity, and it returns a menu inflator. So I'm going to hit enter, then I'll hit dot. I'm invoking get menu inflator directly as opposed to aliasing it out into a variable because I only need to have one invocation on it in this method. If I needed to invoke it more than once, I would alias it out into a method and not call get menu inflator multiple times. Anyway, the method in particular that we're mostly concerned about is, again, super not surprisingly, the inflate method. Now, what does the inflate method want? Now, the inflate method wants a menu resource and a menu. So, what is a menu resource? Well, it's the XML file. However, that file doesn't exist yet. So because that file doesn't exist yet, I won't be able to access the ID for that file. However, knowing how the resources work, I can predict what I need to type in here in order to target the correct menu file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do r dot, so our resources, dot menu, and then I'm going to do something like, I don't know, activity underscore main. Sure. So our menu will follow the same naming convention as our layout. Now, of course, this errors out, as right now it errors out, because I don't have a menu called activity main, but I will here very shortly, so don't worry about that syntax or compiler error. The second parameter is a menu, and that's not surprisingly happens to be the menu object, which is going to receive all the elements that have been inflated. Okay, so the next thing we got to do is we got to return a value because there is a Boolean return value. And basically what happens here, if I can actually type, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to want to return true. And really all that does is it specifies to Android that I want the menu to be used. If I return false, it would tell Android that I don't want the menu to be used at all. So pretty straightforward, we got to return true. Okay, so what's the next step? Well, the next step is going to be, obviously, we need to create our activity main menu. So to do that, I'm going to open up my resource folder, and you'll notice that I don't have a menus folder. So it's important, you notice how we access our.menu. What that should imply to people watching is that menu is a different kind of resource. It's not a values, it's not a bitmap, it's not a layout, it's not a drawable, it's a menu. And that should also imply that it deserves its own resource folder under the res folder. So what we can do here is I can go ahead and right-click, go to New, and there's two ways to do this. I could do Android Resource Directory, type in menu, then right-click that, and then go to a menu. Or I can go to the Android Resource File Wizard. And the Android Resource File Wizard lets me basically first type in my file name, which is going to be activity main. Now this is significant. I need to make sure that my name of my menu is the same name that I'm accessing for my r.menu constants. So I'm going to call it activity main. And then the next important thing I got to do is I got to change the resource type into a menu. And then I'll leave the directory name as menu, which is the only way to do that. I'll leave the source set as main, root elements, menu, can't change that, and I don't need any qualifiers. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. Now I have activity main. If you're paying close attention, you'll notice that the error main activity went away. Now we have an activity main. And I can control click on it to jump back into the menu resource. Anyway, awesome stuff. We have our activity main menu. So let's do something interesting, I guess. The most interesting, well, not the most interesting thing, but the first thing you might want to do with the menu is add a menu item. And you do that by specifying, not surprisingly, the item element. So I'm going to open up a item. Because right now, nothing special is going to happen. Because right now, there's no items in the menu. The action bar is just going to be itemless, just like it was before. Okay, so our item, you'll notice that there's only going to be, oh, come on. There's only going to be one required element, and that is the title, as you can see right here. So to specify that, we simply are going to do Android:title equals, and we're going to give this item a title, such as do or thing. I'm going to keep it short, and you'll see why I'm keeping it short here in a moment. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to see what this looks like on both of our action bars. So here we are, and we now have an overflow menu. And that overflow menu has an item called thing. So, yeah. So what we have here is we created a menu item, and that menu item, the Android operating system decided to place it into the overflow menu, and it's going to generally do that by default. However, there's a couple ways that we can do to override it. So let's go ahead and specify our item in such a way that it displays on the menu bar. To do that, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to access a special property, and that property is very interesting. And it's interesting because it's not going to come from the Android namespace. It's going to be show as action, but you'll notice right here it's saying my autocomplete saying Android show as action. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to do it wrong first, and the reason I'm doing it wrong is because Android Studio will tell me it's wrong and offer to fix it. So I'm kind of lazily using the IDE to do something that I probably should memorize the exact URL for. But essentially what's going to happen, essentially what's going to be wrong with this, is we're using our AppCompat, right? We're using an action bar that did not come from the Android operating system. We're using an action bar implementation that came from a jar that was added to our application, which means it can't come. Okay, we'll back up for a second. Show as action. Remember how I said this menu file used to be used for that 6-button thing that you got when you popped open your menu, the menu button on your phone? Well, all of this menu stuff existed on Android since Android 1. All the item and the menu and the XMLNS Android title, for example. But show as action didn't. Show as action was an attribute that came from Android after the action bars were released, meaning accessing that attribute from the Android namespace isn't going to be correct because our action bar comes from a jar file that is included in our app itself. So watch this, what happens. If I do Android show as action, and I'm going to do iframe. I'll talk about what iframe means in a second. Notice how we're getting some squigglifying action here on this line, on this attribute. And if I hover over and take a look at the error, it's going to say should use app show as action with the AppCompat library with mxlns app equals blah. So let's go ahead and have IntelliJ fix this for me, and I'll tell you exactly what's going on. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace Android : with app : then on the squiggles right there, I'm going to go ahead and hit Alt Enter and then select Create Namespace Declaration up there on the menu that'll appear. So we're now referencing the app namespace. What is the app namespace? Well, I want to point out real fast that XML namespaces are arbitrary, meaning I could have defined this namespace declaration that appeared right here, and I could have changed it from app to app2, and the code will still work. What matters is this attribute is being wired up to this schema, this apk res auto URL, which looks really weird. So what's going on here? Basically, the Android namespace is used to refer to anything, any attribute that's a part of the Android API, or the part of the SDK that we're targeting. The app namespace, or the namespace specified by this URL, refers or can refer to any attribute that's defined in the project that we're working on, or any of the jars that are included as dependencies. Meaning, this show as action attribute comes from AppCompat. Yes, it exists in the Android namespace, but AppCompat won't pick it up if we use the Android namespace. It'll ignore it. Why? Because AppCompat is controlling the action bar. Android is not. So we need to specify our attributes that are specific to AppCompat using the app namespace, or rather any namespace that's resolved to this URL. Okay, so I just hope I'm pointing that out for you guys. Whenever you are clear enough, lint is pretty good. IntelliJ is pretty good at telling you when You should probably use, your Res Auto namespace instead of your Android namespace. And when it does, all you have to do to make this appear is to just type in app colon, pretend that the namespace exists, hit Alt Enter, and it'll specify the proper namespace for us. Or you could memorize this particular schema and add it in manually itself. Or it might be automatically added in already for you by IntelliJ. Either way, remember, if you are accessing something that comes from a support library, it needs to be prefixed not with the Android namespace, but with this namespace. There are so many problems online that you can just go searching online and find so many issues with people who are referencing the wrong namespace, and they're wondering why their attribute is not being picked up. So always keep that in the back of your mind. Anyway, let's talk about the attribute itself. Show as action. What does that mean? Show as action determines whether or not this particular item is going to appear in the overflow menu or on the action bar itself. So we have a couple options here, and some of them are mutually exclusive. So for example, never and always are going to be mutually exclusive. So basically, you can't do never and always because they're opposites. If room can't be combined with always or never either because if room is a predicate. So what does if room mean? Well, I mean, literally, that's what it means. It means it's going to show as an action. It'll show as an item in the action bar if there's enough room for this thing to display. So let's go ahead and hit play and see what happens. I keep on calling it play. I've been doing too much Unity stuff recently, I guess. Anyway, as you see, thing on both Android 4 and Android 5 is now an action. And an action is really just a button that's directly on the action bar. So that's pretty exciting. We also have other things, like we also have this collapsed action view. We'll talk about that in a later video when we talk about action views. We also have this with text. Now, with text is going to be infuriating for everyone because what with text means is it means that if you have an icon on this menu item and you have a title, then it should display both the icon and the title. Unfortunately, it generally will never ever do that with a phone because it'll decide there's not enough room. So in order to, on a phone, have an icon display with the text, with the title, you're generally going to have to use a custom view, which I'll show you guys how to do as well. Speaking of icons, we can specify an icon. That's another very popular thing. And basically, if we specify an icon, our title is no longer going to be used if it's an action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the icon as mipmap, resource mipmap IC launcher, which is just this free icon that just happens to come with our app. If you recall, it's under the mipmap folder in our IC launcher. And I generally use it as a placeholder icon if I'm too lazy to go get a proper placeholder icon. So now if I go ahead and hit play, we see we have a button, but we don't get any text. Even if I went back in and I said, if room with text and hit play, I don't know if I'm ever going to stop calling this play. I should be saying run, I think. Anyway, you'll notice that text does not appear. So it kind of lies to us, and that's always sad. But the point is that if you want something with text and if room at the top of the screen, then you're going to have to do a custom view. All right, I guess at this point, there's one more thing I want to point out, and then we'll talk about how we detect when items are selected. Now, the one thing I want to point out is our tooling. So the Android Studio tooling is very, very, very good. I really like the tooling that Google put together. I can't believe they used to use Eclipse to do this stuff. And what's cool about this tooling is we have a preview right here, but you notice the preview is blank. It's not showing us our item. And the reason that is because it doesn't have enough information to render. It needs to know which activity this menu is going to belong to before it'll render a preview. It needs to know that because themes are activity specific. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do what's called associate this this resource with an activity, just like how we do with our layouts. So to do that, we click on this button right here. I don't know how that button at all means associate with activity. With that icon, they were really grasping at straws. But let's go ahead and click on that and say associate with other activity. And it's going to give us a menu or a list of activities we can associate it with. Now in this particular example, this particular project, we have one activity. So we select that activity and we hit OK. Now you'll notice what happens is we have a couple things happen at the top of the file. So first of all, we have a new XML namespace called tools. And second, we have a tools context equals main activity. This is exactly what happened in our layout file. So our tools namespace, our attributes defined by our tools namespace, are effectively ignored by Android. And they're only used by, well, you guessed it, our tools. And I just discovered a bug with the preview. Basically, it seems to really not like ActionBar. So let's go ahead and, I guess, override its usual behavior of picking our applications or activities theme, and instead directly tell it to use the material theme as the preview. Hopefully this issue is fixed in later versions of IntelliJ, or maybe this issue is present because of a particular problem with it loading up the ActionBar library, seeing as it's a external dependency and not baked into IntelliJ itself. Anyway, to get the preview to work, you're going to have to decide, do you want to preview in hollow or material? Now, since ActionBar is the closest thing is material, let's go ahead and pick that. To do that, I'm going to click right here on this app theme right here, and I'm going to get a theme picker. So I have things like my my project themes, my material themes, my hollow themes, and so on. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick material light, and I'm going to say material.light.dark ActionBar, because that most closely resembles the ActionBar version that we're using. Then I'll hit OK, and now we have our ActionBar. And check that out, we have our button right there. Okay, so that was exciting. Let's go ahead and handle click events. So, jumping back to our main activity, the way that we handle click events is pretty straightforward. The click events were pretty much handled in the same way since Android 1 came out. So it's a similar thing where we hook into a method, such as on create options menu, of course, it's going to be a different method, that is going to be invoked every time an option is clicked on. So it'll be an override, it'll be public, it'll return a boolean, and it's going to be called on options item selected, and it's going to take in a menu item. In this case, I'm going to call it item. So what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to make a toast. I'm going to say toast dot make toast, passing in this as the context, passing in let's do item dot get title as the text, and let's do a duration of toast dot length short, and we'll do dot show, and then we're going to go ahead and I guess return true to specify that we handled this method. And it looks like I have a typo here, so let's go ahead and fix that. On options item selected. And now that's all working, and let's go ahead and hit play. I really am seriously not trying to say play, but it just every time. Wait a year or two. Actually, let's make this example a little bit more interesting. I'm going to go ahead and jump into my menu again. Oh, it looks like one of my devices died. I'm going to copy and paste this, and so we have two. So we'll have another thing as well as a thing. So they'll both have the same icon. Anyway, let's go ahead and play. Since one of my devices died, wonder which one it was. Looks like my 4 device died, so I'll close down my 4 emulator and bring back my Lollipop emulator. And now notice when I click on this, I get thing. When I click on that, I get another thing. So, yeah. And, of course, I can add in another item if I wanted to. And I can say, show as action, and I can type in never and hit play. And of course, what that'll do is that'll put it into the overflow menu for us. And now we have another thing. All right, that's actually not the easiest way to determine which item was clicked, however. Typically, you would want to switch on an ID or some sort of integer, some sort of flag. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and name each one of these items. So the first one, I'm going to give an ID. So I'm just going to type in ID and hit enter, just like how we would create an ID in a layout. And I'll also use the same syntax to create an ID. So it'll be @ plus ID slash, and I'm going to say activity main menu thing. And I'll do this one. I'll say ID is plus ID activity main menu another thing. And I'll do ID is plus activity main menu more things. Of course, we can't reuse the same ID for two elements. That'll result in an error. So now if I come back to main activity, on my on options item selected code, I can go ahead and say if item dot get item ID equals r.id activity main menu, and I can use one of the 3 IDs that I just created. So let's do menu thing. And I'll put in some special logic, and then if it's not menu thing, I'll go ahead and make the toast. So in this case, I'm going to make another toast. I'm going to say make toast this item, or sorry, not item. I'm going to say this is a special toast. Toast length short dot show. So basically what I'm looking for here is if I click on that first button, I should get a special toast that isn't just its title. So that gives me the title, and then this gives me this is a special toast. And again, the reason is we detected which item. So the menu item that is passed in is the menu, or the menu object that was instantiated due to inflating the menu XML resource. And that's how you handle buttons. Anyway, that's really not the only thing you can do with the ActionBar actions. There's a couple more interesting, cool stuff words. There's a couple more things we can do with it, but I'll go ahead and I'll leave that for the next video. So we'll see you guys then.